So it was such a pity, and I'm so sorry that I didn't make up my appointment.
Well, I have some good news for you, Charlie. I was just talking to Jennifer Carter, and she sends her best wishes.
Thank you. I like her a lot, and thank you for introducing her to me. So she went to Taiwan for 2 times, attending our conference, and we did some research together in Green Island. That's a wonderful experience. Thank you so much.
Well, you published together too, didn't you?
Yes, we did. In her new book. Have you got her new book? Let me.
I don't think I have. No.
I think that was very, very new. Let me check. Where was that?
Well, she's checking, Daphne. I see there's one other person that I've not yet met.
Yes. Let us introduce her to you.
Yes, and she is Lucia, right? Lucia. She's also the editor. Yes. Or we mention her as Miss Huang. Miss Huang.
Hi,
Hi.
Robert. I'm Lucia Huang. I'm the editor of the Museum Island Colon.
I'm pleased to meet you, Lucia. I have a couple of technical questions. Your questions were so substantive and so sort of broad ranging and deep that I had to make notes because some of it goes way back in my career, 30 years ago or more. So I have notes. So if I put these notes up on the screen, can you still see me okay?
Let's try.
Can you still see my image if I put my notes up?
It's up now. We can see your
Right.
face right now, but we can't see the note.
Okay, but can you see me if I open my notes? I'm going to open my notes. Can you still see me?
Please open your note. We will check if we can see you.
My notes are now open.
Oh, great. Yes, we can see you.
I can't see any of you. I can just see my notes, which is normally what Zoom allows you to do. You can see me. I can see my notes, but I can't see you. So is that working okay now?
First, can we do the video recording now?
Yes.
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 那黄录音哦。
So can you see me okay if I'm using my notes? I'm going to put my notes on the screen now. I don't want anybody to see the notes except for me, but I want you to be able to see me. So is this working okay now? I've just put my notes up. Can you see me?
I can see you, but I cannot see the notes.
You cannot see the notes.
How about Daphne? 你看得到吗？
No, that's good because I don't want you to see the notes. I'm just going to use them for answering the question. I just want you to see me, not my notes.
Okay, that's great.
Okay.
And can we put our questions in the PPT and show it on the screen? So we can follow these questions.
And we're going to go through those 6 questions that you sent to me, the revised questions.
Yes.
Okay, I think I'm ready for that. How long do you think we're going to be talking?
1 hour or 90 or 1 hour and a half, probably.
Okay. Okay, but if I go on too long, just tell me to stop.
Okay. Thank you. No problem for that. So the purpose of our interview are 2. One is for an e-news article, which will be written by our reporters. And the other is for my research project. So we have a question for both purposes, as I explained in the email. And I will ask Stephanie to do the interview now.
Yes. Okay. Robert, may I ask, can you see the slide in the front page?
Yes, I can.
Sure.
Dr. Robert James Museum Activist, an interview February 28th.
Yes, and maybe we should skip the introduction of ourselves, or we should go down.
黄璐，你有录影吗？
有，我有录了。
好，OK，
Okay, now we are on recording, and I would like to first introduce Professor Jia Li. Okay, Professor Jia Li is now the professor of Graduate Institute of Museum Studies at the Taipei National University of the Arts, and she is also the consultant of the National Museum of Human Rights in Taiwan, and she received her PhD degree in Museum Studies in University of Leicester in 2003, and she's now the chief editor of the e-news website, as we mentioned, the Museum Island website. And Lucia Huang, she is also the editor of the e-news website, and I am the reporter of today's interview, and also the second-year graduate student in the Graduate Institute of Museum Studies. So now I think we should go on to our questions. So first of all, Robert, I would like you to please tell us about your academic background and your professional experience.
Well, thank you very much, Daphne. I'm delighted to be here and meet all of you for the first time.
Thank you.
Before I answer the first question, though, I want to engage in a certain protocol because the country of Canada is now in a truth and reconciliation process with its Indigenous peoples. We've treated Indigenous peoples in Canada very poorly for centuries, and that's now been recognized. So in the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, I want to honor and acknowledge the Canmore area, the town where I live, which is the homeland of the Stoney Nakoda First Nation where I live and work. I also want to acknowledge Treaty 7 territory of the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is composed of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai. This territory is also the home of the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. So I want to thank all of our ancestors, those I know and I don't know, who have created the human web of life. So thank you, Daphne, for allowing me to give that recognition. In answer to the first question, I'm currently an independent scholar and practitioner.
Okay.
And a fellow at the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester, a fellow of the Canadian Museums Association, and I've also was editor-in-chief of the Journal of Museum Management and Curatorship, but I've now retired from that position. I was the president and CEO of the Glenbow Museum for 11 years in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, the founding director of the Northern Heritage Center in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, which is the northern part of Canada, and we'll talk more about that later. And I was also the founding executive director of the Science Institute of the Northwest Territories, which was also in Yellowknife. I also am the founder of the Coalition of Museums for Climate Justice, and again, we'll talk about that later.
Yes.
I have a PhD in subarctic archaeology, and I began my career in Canada's remote Northwest Territories. And it's there that I worked with Indigenous peoples for the first time. And I've been doing so throughout my career since then, which spans about 48 years, in and around museums as a director, a consultant, an author, an editor, an archaeologist, a board member, a teacher, a volunteer, and philanthropist. And I've always devoted my career to championing museums as important social institutions that can make a positive difference in the life of individuals, families, and communities. My research interests include museum management and organizational change, the social responsibilities of museums, museum activism, and the repatriation of Indigenous cultural material. I've written about 150 articles, given about 150 principal key addresses, and 10 books, and my publications have been translated into 10 different languages.
Yeah.
So that's a summary at this point in time.
Thank you, Robert, for giving us such a detailed background of yours. And I noticed that you graduated as an archaeological researcher and later on being a director of museum director. And I would like to know, during the period you do your graduate research with the traditional hunting camp, right, I noticed that you spent 6 months with the Canadian Indigenous. Can you share more experience at that period, and how does that intimate experience change you or move you and affect how you later on be a director, how that changed your way to lead the museum?
Well, that experience with the Dene First Nation, which is one of the greatest hunting cultures in the world, was a transformative experience for me as a graduate student in archaeology. I was doing field research for my dissertation in the subarctic, and I was doing it on the cultural history of the Dene First Nation. But it occurred to me that while I was in the field doing the research, I didn't know any Dene people personally. And that was because in the Western scientific tradition, you weren't supposed to be interested in people as an archaeologist. You were just supposed to be interested in objects, in stone tools, arrowheads, that sort of thing, material culture. And I realized that was a big mistake in my training. So I dropped out of graduate school for a while with my wife, and we went back north again to live in the bush with about 5 traditional hunting families near the Arctic Circle who were still living off the land. And it's there that I learned a whole lot of things that formed the values which later guided my museum management and my involvement in museology. Because when you think about it, the hunting way of life is really about self-organization and flexible work design. So I learned all kinds of values when I was living with these hunters. I learned that hierarchy wasn't important, that leadership is really based on respect and competence.
Yeah.
I learned about self-organization, how you can trust people. If you know what the purpose is, you can trust them to get on with doing the job, which is really about personal agency, which is really taking action in the world. I learned about generosity in this very serious environment. I learned about small group culture where beliefs and values are shared. And perhaps most importantly, I learned all about social ecology, which really means that social and cultural issues are deeply intertwined with the natural environment. And you have to consider both at the same time. So that was a transformative experience. And I became accustomed to other ways of knowing. I was introduced to an indigenous worldview. And that has guided my work ever since.
Great. Good to know the transformation. Thank you for sharing this intimate experience with us. And next, we would like to move on to the second question. Like, what are some memorable moments or projects from your over 40-year, or as you mentioned, nearly 48 years career in museum field?
Well, I think that experience living with indigenous people up there led to my first job, because I was appointed the executive director of a museum that was just an idea, the Northern Heritage Center.
Yes.
I was given the job. I didn't have any formal museum training. I never worked in a museum. But when I think back about that, I think that maybe that was actually a bit of good luck, a bit of good fortune, because I had no preconceived ideas and assumptions or museum traditions that I had to honor. It was sort of like a blank slate. I could think and I could work creatively as the first executive director. So I assembled the best team of curators and designers that I could, and we took us 3 years. We built the building from the ground up. We did all the programming, all the staffing, and we opened it 3 years later. That was a transformative experience. But I also learned when I was there that our sort of traditions, and I don't know what it's like for you in your country, but we just assume that museums are good things, that you collect things and you put them in glass boxes and you show them to people, and that's an important thing. But when I was living in the Northwest Territories, in the town where I lived, there were about maybe 15,000 people. The whole territory, only about 100,000 people in 1/3 of the landmass of Canada. So very low population density, and 65% were Indigenous people. And they actually were a bit alienated by museums, because they said, you're freezing our culture. You're putting it in a glass box as if we no longer exist. And here we are, we're living here, we're in the government, we have good jobs, we're leading our lives. So that caused me and our staff to have a completely different look at what does collecting and what does heritage preservation really mean. So another transformative experience was we discovered that this very important technology of making boats out of moose skins long ago had disappeared. But we knew that there were some elders who could still do this craft and this technology, which was very key to their livelihood before the Euro-Canadian arrived. So we took a group of elders and a film crew high up into the mountains, and for 3 months, the elders built one of these moose skin boats for the first time in their living memory. They said, we've not seen one. We remember from our grandparents how to do it. We built the boat. We made a movie about it, which became very popular. And the boat is now preserved in the Northern Heritage Center. So that's all to say that we have to always test our assumptions about what's important. And what was important to those elders and to that First Nation was to get into the mountains and relive their cultural heritage, reconnect with that collective memory from a long time ago. And it became a real contribution to their sense of well-being.
Sure. Yes.
So then, should I carry on? I mean, there are a couple of other transformative experiences that might be relevant.
Great.
After 14 years and raising a family in the Northwest Territories, we returned to Southern Canada, to the province of Alberta, where I am now living, to the city of Calgary. You might have heard of them. Well, about the day after I got the job, I was told by the governing authority that the money that we were normally getting from the government was going to be reduced by 42%. Nobody had told me that when they gave me the job offer.
Okay.
So I look back at that now with humor, but at that time, it was a complete shock.
Yeah.
So we sat down with our staff, because in those days, we were getting about 90% of our money for the museum from the government, and we had about 150 staff. We were spending about $20 million a year, and we looked at the numbers in light of a 42% reduction, and it meant that unless we did something completely drastic, the museum would close. It would be out of business. So we set about this process of culture change. We developed a new strategic plan that had measurable goals.
Yeah.
We reduced the hierarchy. When I went to that museum, there were 20 separate departments, and we collapsed all those departments into 4 multifunctional work units, where curators worked along with conservators worked with marketers, and so on. We got rid of those sort of disciplinary silos so that all the staff were acting, cross-practicing, sharing information and knowledge. We developed a commercial enterprise so that we could increase our earned revenues. We had rentals, we had a shop, we had a restaurant, we had a framing business, we had conservation services. Most importantly, we distanced ourselves from government because we felt that the bureaucracy of the government was not allowing enough creative energy to express itself, because we had a great staff, creative, intelligent, and committed. But all these bureaucratic processes and procedures were hindering our effort to adapt to the fact that we just lost half our money. One of the most important process was deaccessioning. And you all know what that is. That is no longer honoring that the museum must keep everything for all time. We determined that we had a lot of objects in our collection, which is about 2 million objects, that weren't relevant to our mandate. So we went through them very carefully. We got expert opinions as well as our staff opinion, and decided that we could get rid of a substantial number of these objects. We deaccessioned the objects. We gave them to museums that wanted them, but those that weren't wanted, we put on auction. And we developed an endowment fund of several $1 million, the income from which we used to take care of the objects that we decided to keep. So overall, really major change, because we successfully challenged various traditional museum practices, because in those days, deaccessioning was a bad word. You weren't supposed to do it. We nurtured an organizational culture based on collective purpose and openness and experimentation. We diversified our revenue base to make Glenbow the most financially self-sufficient of the 10 largest museums in Canada. And a small but really important project in my mind was developing the museum school at our museum. Because up until that time, students whether they were in kindergarten or high school, they would come to the museum maybe once a year for a 2 or 3 hour visit. Well, we developed a museum school where they came for a minimum of 10 days. And before the students came, they worked with Glenbow staff to design a custom program that would suit what the teacher and the students wanted, and would draw on up to 30 or 40 of Glenbow staff. And I was really impressed by what was done, because I was getting mail from parents who said, my daughter went to the museum school and we now have different conversations at dinner because she was so moved by the school. So just an example of an innovation, when you really let staff express their creativity and get on with the work.
Yeah.
But having said that, there were some pretty unhappy results too, because in the course of transforming the organization, we had to let 25 of our staff go. They lost their jobs. And as a result, I received a death threat from one of the employees. But I understand why that person was so upset. But all of this caused me to ask, why are museums doing what they're doing? Surely it has to be more than just informal education and leisure entertainment. So those experiences led to my interest in the social responsibility of museums, including museum activism, which I know that you're aware of.
Yes.
All of this material is in the book, Museums and Paradox of Change, which is now in its 3rd edition. And I understand it's sold nearly 5,000 copies. So maybe there's some useful stuff in there for museum people to consider.
Agree.
The museum school is very interesting. Yeah, can you explain it a little bit more about the museum school that you established in Glenbow Museum? What age groups are these museum school for, and what did they do in the 10 days? 10 days learning.
There were really all ages, but I think that the biggest population were elementary schools and elementary schools and junior high schools. And the teacher who was interested would get together with one of our curators, and together they would work out a proposal, because maybe the teacher had some flexibility in her curriculum so that she was interested in the environment, or she was interested in Canadian history, or she was interested in Indigenous peoples. So together with our staff, they would design a project, the students would come, and we did have a classroom where they sat and they ate their lunches, and sometimes they listened to the teacher and they did some of their homework and their reading. But mostly they went through the entire museum. And this is a big museum. It was about 8 stories of 300,000 square feet. And depending upon what they were studying, we would match them with, we had Indigenous staff. So we would match the students with Indigenous staff. We would match the students with a conservator. We would match them with an anthropologist, an archaeologist, a social historian. And together they would use the museum collections to understand more fully what their project was all about, and to sort of enact their curriculum. So it was a totally sort of a cooperative, collegial project, custom designed for each particular teacher and each particular classroom. But of course, a lot of teachers weren't interested because it was a lot of extra work for the teacher and for the student. But for those that wanted that kind of experience, it really fulfilled, I think, a lot of interests and aspirations, because you can't do a whole lot if you visit a museum for 3 hours once a year.
Thank you. That's very interesting.
And let's look back to the you mentioned that first, when you be the director of Glenbow Museum, you have to cut off 25 employees, and I believe at the moment you must maybe set a conference with your other staff and to reconsider what the museum's mission, and you must be struggling yourself. So I would like to know what happened in that moment. Maybe you have a meeting, or what's in your mind to make such a decision.
Well, it was a long process. We did the plan in about the first 2 years, but it was such a change for everyone that it took a lot of talking. It took a lot of consultation. It took a lot of empathy and compassion to do this. And I could say, I was there for 11 years, and those 11 years, our new approach to museology, our new approach to staff and how the museum should operate was still unfolding. It was a never-ending process. There's just so many things. You should have a look at the book because, for example, when I was there was a very sort of negative relationship between senior management and our staff union. There was a great big gap there.
Yes.
Lack of information, lack of transparency. Well, one thing we did right away was put the president of the union on our board of governors so that she could listen to everything that was going on, which really helped to build up trust. Because often people, if they don't know what's really going on, they'll make something up. And that was happening in Glenville. So there were so many small things we did like that. And in an effort to say, open up, make things visible, make things transparent, tell the truth. If we didn't have the answer to something, we said we don't know, but let's work on it together.
Agree.
Perhaps most importantly, though, we were living in the heart of the homeland of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And as I mentioned in the acknowledgement, that consisted of 3 separate nations, First Nations, and we were living right in their territory. And the relationship between those indigenous peoples and the museum was terrible. The Blackfoot were ignored by the museum. And that, was counter to my experience in the North, because in the North, indigenous peoples were the majority of representatives in the government. They wore the 3-piece suits. The entire time that I was in the Northwest Territories, I reported to an indigenous person. It was completely the opposite in Southern Canada, where indigenous peoples were marginalized. They weren't treated with empathy or respect. And so we decided that we would just make the commitment to try and improve that relationship. And that presented a bit of a challenge because, museums try to be so many things to so many different people. And we said, no, we're going to use the lion's share of our energy and our relationship buildings working with this particular group of people, these 3 First Nations. Actually, there's a 4th First Nation that's resident in the US. They also were part of this. And that began a 12-year relationship, which ultimately resulted in the largest repatriation of indigenous objects in Canadian history, where we turned back all these objects. These objects, especially the medicine bundle, it's a collection of objects that they've garnered through time that allow them to communicate with the Creator. So spiritually, you could call it religiously, they're very important. And we decided to simply give all those bundles back to the Blackfoot Confederacy because they needed them. They needed them to rekindle their sense of self. They needed them to rekindle their cultural loss, which they've been suffering for so many years under the Canadian government and the dominant society. But we learned so much in the process because these medicine bundles, as I said, they're objects and songs for communicating with the Creator. Well, before we decided to give them back, we used to loan them to Blackfoot ceremonialists so that they could carry on with their ceremonies, but then they would have to give them back to us at the museum. That was before we sort of saw the light. But the problem was in keeping with professional conservation rules, we would put those bundles in a freezer. So in case there were any insects on them or infestations, we would kill them before the objects went back into the collection storage. Well, one day, 3 elders came to me and they said, Bob, those medicine bundles are like children to us, and you're putting them in the freezer.
Wow.
You shouldn't do that anymore. And so we immediately understood. We completely changed our professional practice. So we didn't use freezers anymore. We would hold them in a special room that we had built, and they would be inspected very carefully without using the freezer. And we did that for a couple of years until we decided we should give all these things back. We have no business keeping them because we don't have the knowledge of how to use them. And we know that if they get returned to the community, they're going to enhance well-being in ways that we will never understand. So again, it was learning and changing.
Yeah. From the case, I can tell you are really treating. You are really leading a museum with respect and to improve the relationship with the indigenous group. And And as you mentioned, the repatriation case is so phenomenal. And how does that affect the relationship with the museum and the indigenous group, even till now? How does that sustain, or how does that affect the relationship? Do you still have some collaboration or still work together?
That's a very good question, because I'm not working in that institution. I left that institution over 20 years ago, and I'm sad to say that the leaders at that museum now do not have the interest that we had in forging those relationships. They're doing some of the work, but not nearly what we were committed to when I was there and when other curators were there who have now left. I mean, when I think about it, I bet there have been at least 25 PhD and master's theses done on the work that we were doing with that indigenous community, but that work has really slowed down, which is unfortunate, because it was so inspirational. We did something also that I don't think any other museum has yet to do in Canada. I don't know about Taiwan or America, but we decided to do a major exhibition, an 10,000 square foot exhibition on the Blackfoot Confederacy. And so rather than having our curators do the storyline, our designers do the design, everything, we got together with 18 Blackfoot elders who held the knowledge and wisdom of their culture, and they became the exhibition team, so that the Glenbow staff just served as advisors and resource people, but the Blackfoot elders did all the research and all the design and all the storyline writing. I think this is the first time a museum exhibit like that has ever been turned over to a group of people outside the museum who had complete control over the content and the preservation. And we found that after that exhibit opened, that Blackfoot families from all over the southern Alberta would bring their children to the museum to teach them about their traditional ways. And I can't think of a bigger compliment to a museum exhibition than seeing that happen.
Yes, that's a
But
very.
also, I'm concentrating on indigenous peoples, but we also, worked with people in mainstream society. We worked with the African community in the same way, so that we developed an exhibit on Africa as a country then and now. We had a major exhibition on breast cancer, because one of our curators got breast cancer, and she wanted to communicate with others in the community who were experiencing the similar thing. So they all got together and did an exhibition on breast cancer, which was put together by women with that illness. Lots of examples of that. But I think the whole message is you have to open up and start listening to your community and taking the risks to do so.
Taking the risk, yes. From the experience and cases you kill, I can tell that you are a very ongoing learner as a director, and not repeating the same way, the same old thing in your career. And how come do you be so bold and so enthusiastic in learning new things as yourself?
You mean in being a learner?
Being a learner, and what drives you to learn new things and constantly updating yourself?
Well, there must be a lot of reasons for that, but it's funny you should ask that, because you just made me think I grew up. I grew up in a house. My father was a surgeon, and he trained people from around the world. And so we had people staying in our home from Lebanon, Norway, England, China, India. These were medical people that would come, and sometimes they didn't have much money, so they stayed in our house. But they would cook different meals, they would speak different languages, and I think from a very early age I was exposed to cultural diversity. Well, how interesting is this? These people aren't like me. They don't dress like me, they don't talk like me, they have different food. I remember one time some Chinese eggs were sent to our house.
Eggs?
You know what I mean about those eggs that are like 100 years old?
I know the black one. The black.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that was a sort of major, I guess, shock and source of humor for my siblings and our family when we opened these eggs because the smell was just incredible.
Yes.
But anyway, so I got exposed to culture diversity really
Yes.
early on, and then I took a degree in anthropology because I was interested in different cultures, and then I decided I wanted to explore the time depth, so I got a graduate degree in archaeology, went to a very diverse part of Canada. So I guess it's an accumulation of all sorts of different, life experiences, which has caused me to always want to learn it and be open. I mean, I've often said that one of the problems in museums is that we have a lot of leaders, they have 30 years experience, but it's the same year repeated 30 times. They're not listening, they're not learning. And it's so important now, especially as the world's getting so complex.
Thank you for sharing your childhood story. That's very
I don't think I've ever talked about that, but you made me think about that.
yeah, thank you for sharing the story. Okay. Maybe now that we should move on to the next question. And could you share any? Maybe you just share share any personal stories or experience that influence your views on the significance of museum in addressing social issues. Like, what do you believe in museum that have such a powerful power in addressing social issues?
Do we want to talk about climate
Sure.
or more broadly? I was just looking at that. There's a question in there about the journal.
Yes.
Is that relevant?
You can yes, it could be relevant. Yes, it can be relevant.
Because that's also been an important part of
Sure.
of my view.
Oh, great. Then we can relate it to the journal you mentioned, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, should we talk about the Coalition of Museums for Climate Justice?
Coalition, if you want to. Yes, sure. We can talk it first.
Okay, because that was sort of the next, I guess, and then the next big installment in my concern about social issues, because I'd been writing and speaking about the climate crisis for about 16 years.
Yeah. Ooh, 16.
And I became frustrated by the failure of museums in general, especially in Canada, North America. Again, I can't speak for your country, to address the crisis. So in 2016, I decided, with the help of my colleague David Jensen, to send out invitations to my Canadian museum colleagues to ask if they were interested in addressing the climate crisis. And the response that we got back was mixed, but it was positive enough to start building a network, because I still firmly believe that all museums can respond to the consequences of the climate crisis in a manner that will provide mutual support, strength, and guidance to all the other museums, especially because the Canadian Museums Association has yet still to rise to the challenge of climate trauma. They're still ignoring the issue, and they're not providing the sort of support that needs to be done. So I thought, well, maybe we can begin to develop that support network. And it's really not because museums are expected to fix all the social and environmental problems in the world. I mean, they're far too complex, they're far too many. But I still believe they can provide the knowledge and experience and a place for conversations that are essential to building understanding among the public about what's really going on and what's essential for progressive civic action.
Yeah.
So the premise of the coalition is that museums are uniquely qualified to contribute to the issue of climate change because they have a deep sense of time, they're historically conscious, they're committed to long-term stewardship of collections, why not the environment? They have a good knowledge base, they're publicly accessible, and they have unprecedented public trust. So I thought all these things were really important. So the network, the coalition has now become a network and a framework of resources and contacts and ideas and projects to assist all kinds of museums in assuming responsibility for addressing the climate crisis. But I'm no longer involved. I stepped down as the co-chair several years ago. I'm still the founder.
Yeah.
But it remains a loose network of individuals with an interest and a commitment to climate action. There's no formal membership requirement, and it's actually coordinated by a group of volunteers, academics, and practitioners. And a good way to start is just to go to their website, the CMCJ website, and you can get a good overview of what's going on.
Yes. I saw latest post in the website, and I saw a case. It's about a beach museum, and may I know in that case, do you work as a consultant in that case? Because I saw you give some piece of advice in that case.
Yeah, you definitely, but mostly it's unpaid. I mean, sometimes people want to pay, but mostly it's just a free exchange of information and guidance and knowledge and experience. But it is a consultation in that request, and in that respect. But there's also podcasts by guest contributors.
Really?
And the current people who are running it have now translated the entire website into French, so it's now bilingual.
Wow, great.
And they're also doing a major research projects now devoted to the oral histories of individuals and communities that have been directly affected by climate trauma, such as flooding and wildfires.
Yeah.
Because they're going to explore what does it mean to be resilient, as an individual, a family, and a community in light of all these climate catastrophes that are unfolding. And I should point out that, your colleague, Jennifer Carter, is one of the volunteers who coordinates the coalition. It's called the advisory group, and she's one of the advisory groups. So she's doing a great job.
Good to know. And okay, about the coalition. So may I ask if a museum is doing a case, and do they have to reach out to a coalition, or in often cases the coalition will actively reach out to these museum cases? How's the relationship?
I think it's both ways. Yeah, it's a two-way street. But basically, I think that you could describe the coalition as being there as a mutual support network. So if you have a question or a concern about something, you can contact the coalition, and then they'll send out. If they can't answer the question, they'll send it out to various people to respond. I mean, I still get a lot of requests from them about what do you think about this, or what can we do here. So again, it's voluntary, and it's a commitment by people who really care about what's going on.
Good to know. And about the title of this coalition, could you share your ideas about the term climate justice?
Yeah, well, I'm really glad you asked that, because I think it's now time for climate justice to be replaced with the word planetary justice, because climate trauma is only symptomatic now of a much larger problem, which has recently been labeled the poly crisis.
Yes.
And by the poly crisis, I mean there are multiple interconnected problems and stressors and crises that are amplifying over time and creating overwhelming complexity.
Yes.
So the poly crisis now includes unsustainable economic growth. I mean, this idea that we can continue to consume everything we want to, whenever we want to, wherever we want to. It's creating ecological overshoot and the destruction of the natural world upon which we depend for life. Loss of biodiversity, acidification of the oceans, melting of the Arctic ice, not to mention a civilizational overshoot with uncontrolled population growth.
Agreed.
And then we have governments that seem to be ignoring all of these problems and actually going in the wrong direction. We have corporations that are lying and not telling the truth and trying to cover up the extent of the problems. We have the belief called eco-modernism, which is that technology, handheld devices, computer chips are somehow going to save us, that we will be able to carry on the way we're carrying on by just having technology to solve our problems. It can't happen. We have to change our consumptive ways of life. Then we have war. Look at Ukraine. Look at Palestine. Look at Sudan. We have wealth inequality. We have refugees. We have authoritarian governments. I mean, the list goes on and on. So It's
Yeah.
much bigger now than climate justice. The planet needs justice. And I think that museums are in a position to embrace this larger view of reality, because right now we are already using 1.75 planets in terms of the amount of materials we consume and the amount of waste we produce. And that simply can't go on.
Mm.
So our way of life is basically unsustainable. And I want the global community, museum community, to start telling the truth to themselves, to their associations, their governments, and their supporters in their communities. I want all museum workers to use their personal and organizational agency, their knowledge, and their compassion to contribute to the well-being of their communities, to individuals and families and communities, and to tell their leaders that it's no longer business as usual. I'm quite concerned about the weak state of museum leadership, but maybe we can talk about that later. But we really have to stop pretending. We have to start considering what we're going to do as individuals, museum workers, families, communities, institutions, as all these planetary problems become worse. Because we can't wait around waiting for someone to fix it. We have to start assuming responsibilities ourselves.
Agree. Yes. Great. Good. And now, maybe you just answered this question, but still maybe you got more to say about this. So what strategies do you think the museum can apply in promoting climate justice and encourage visitors to take actions individually? Yes.
Well, I think, first of all, I
Yes.
think we all have to, museums included, everyone has to admit that the time we are living in now is far more dangerous and perilous than many of us are willing to admit or understand. I think that's the first thing we have to do.
Yes.
I think that museums have to sit down as a strategy and start a conversation with their staff, with their boards, with their governing authorities, with their governments, with their key stakeholders, and ask the question, why are we doing what we are doing? Because I think as soon as you start asking that question, why are we doing what we're doing? And this is my own experience, admittedly, but I find that it always opens up really interesting conversation, really meaningful conversation, where museum workers start acting out just side of their job description, but they start talking as individual human beings with intelligence and values and commitments. So ask that question, why? And then I find, once that conversation starts, that it clears the field for considering an advocacy policy. And when I say an advocacy policy, I don't mean in the North American understanding where museum advocacy means you go to the government and ask for more money. No, I'm talking about sitting down and identifying key civic and moral issues that the museum cares about and has knowledge about, experience about, and they could assist. Because museums can't be all things to all people. They can become more strategic by saying, this particular issue is really important to our museum. Maybe it's indigenous people, maybe it's homelessness, maybe it's food security, maybe it's the climate trauma. But start that conversation. I think the next strategy is you've got to start to become reality-based. Museums have to start paying attention to what's really going on in the world. And that's, I don't mean internal concerns like audience development, leisure entertainment, how many people come to your restaurant, how many people come through the door. I mean, to what's really going on in the world, socially and environmentally.
Yes.
I also think that museums have to become more focused on relations with people and not just on their collections. And that means recognizing the value of interdependence. I mean, I know that so many museums really value their independence. They're insular. We know what to do. We're the authority. But in the course of thinking like that, you lose all sight of interdependence. So as human beings with the environment, we're all interrelated. And I think museums as a strategy have to begin to recognize that interrelatedness. So those are just some ideas of strategies of how to overcome the status quo.
Yes. Then, as you mentioned, that we are in such a time to face so much public crisis, and the term climate trauma shows that it is such a complex problem we are facing. but still you are still being positive and feeling hopeful to deal with it. Why is that? You are not overwhelmed by the stress, the pressure, or the feeling or of effortless.
Why I'm
Yeah.
still optimistic?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I'm optimistic anymore. My new mantra is hopeless but not helpless.
Ooh.
I do think that I really do believe, and I've always believed, that museums are truly unique and irreplaceable institutions. I mean, first of all, there are 95,000 of them in the world. I've heard a number as high as 104,000. And they are the largest self-organized franchise in the world. I mean, McDonald's restaurants, I think there's 33,000. Well, there's 95,000 museums, and they're public storefronts. They're places where people can come in with their family, with their children, with their relatives, and feel comfortable and enjoy themselves. Well, the government doesn't offer that sort of storefront.
Yeah.
Corporations don't offer that. So to me, that's a real strength. And when you combine that public storefront with the idea that museums they're grounded in locality.
Yeah.
You know, for better or for worse, they know their communities. They can act as a bridge between science and the humanities. They act as a bridge between culture and the natural world. Museum collections, they're seed banks of sustainable living practices that have guided our culture and world civilization for millennia. You know, and as industrial culture begins to break down, the knowledge that museums hold is like having a seed bank. It's like having a biological seed bank, which are now being developed around the world. Well, museums have that same kind of seed bank, except it's a material culture, and it's all about the knowledge about how we've adapted as human beings. So it's irreplaceable. Another thing is that museums are really good at learning, and they're fun, and they introduce fun into learning. So those are just some characteristics that keep me motivated about the unique value of museums. But, you know, regrettably, I don't think that museums themselves, generally speaking, are aware of all those strengths. And they're not using them the way we could. So I guess I've spent my career trying to prod museums to pay attention to their real skills. I don't know if you know of the museologist Marjorie Schwartzer, but she wrote about me a while ago, and she said, quote, Robert Jane's stock and trade in his long and varied museum career has been upending the field's sacred cows and entrenched positions with that rare combination of persistence, rigor, courage, and elegance. Okay. So I guess, end quote. So I guess for me to unlock the potential of museums, I've had to become sort of an internal critic. But as you pointed out, I'm still trying to be as optimistic and positive as I can be.
It's good to see you are still persistent and yes, still being learning new things and not repeating the same year again and again. As you mentioned. No, thank you for really sharing your insights and ideas. And now I think we should move on to the museum activism you published and edited with Professor Richard Sandel in 2019, because we have some questions about museum activism. So could you share with your ideas and concepts of museum activism?
Yes, I'm just I'm just getting some notes, right, to keep oriented here.
Sure. Some notes.
So, okay, so activism, yes. Well, that's been a natural evolution for me, right? Because I first learned that assuming museums did certain things this way and not that way was wrong when I encountered indigenous peoples. That led me to the question of why are we doing what we're doing?
Yeah.
That then has led me to be interested in the social responsibilities. And now the social responsibility has evolved into this notion of activism. And the idea that museums have to consider whether or not they want to become forces for good in their communities. And I think that underlying the notion of activism are three requirements. The first one is that museums need to be open to influence and impact from outside the museum. This notion of insularity, this notion of that the museum is the neutral authority, has all the knowledge, has to go. Museums have to open up themselves to impact and influence from outside the museum. And in doing that, they have to be responsive to citizens' interests and concerns. And I think the third thing is they have to be fully transparent in fulfilling the first two expectations, which is to be open to influence and then be responsive. And this is a really big challenge for museums, because most of them are not interested in doing that or comfortable doing that because they see themselves as an authority.
Also.
There's also almost a spiritual dimension to this, because I think all museums are now at a point in their history and development where they have to consider why museums exist, why they're valuable, and what do they mean in terms of identity, community, and the future of our civil life. So again, big questions, but the museums have to start paying attention. We need to really, we need to create a new breed of museums that's grounded in the consciousness of the world around us and committed to enhancing the well-being. When you think about the history of museums, one can be a bit optimistic because museums really began, as imperial treasures, where wealthy elite societies plundered the world, started these cabinets of curiosities for all the interesting stuff they took from other places and other cultures, turned them into the cabinet of curiosities, evolved into museums. That took hundreds of years. Then for the next couple hundred years, museums became centers of public education to inform the public, to enhance the value of their lives, to educate them.
Yeah.
And in my career, I've seen the museum evolve to an appendage of consumer society. Basically, a lot of museums are just like malls now. They're only interested in what they sell in their shop, what they sell in their dining room, how many people came through the door, and all they talk about is money. So I think that the museum as mall is coming to an end now because the planet, if for no other reason, can't support this level of consumption. So we've got imperial collections, educational institutions, museum as malls. So now we're at a watershed now. And I think museums are in a position to choose which direction do they want to go. Do they want to stay with the past, which is now the museum as mall, or do they really want to become a new breed of museums, which is committed to enhancing the well-being of individuals, families, and communities? And as I said earlier, that does not mean that they become Greenpeace activists or revolutionaries. It means they give serious consideration to critical civil and moral issues in their communities and decide where they can help and what they can do and where they can add value based on their knowledge and experience.
Yes, you do tell the future direction, hopefully, as we hope to be the museum's future direction.
That's exactly right. That opportunity and responsibility is in front of us now, but we're running out of time. It's time to act.
Yes. Oh, I remember you mentioned in other interview, you mentioned that museums better not only make people be aware of the climate trauma, but better be panic or very chaos about this kind of urgent need, right?
Yeah. The urgency is really important. On a personal note, one of our children and her family still lives in the Northwest Territories, and they had a horrible wildfire season last summer, and her entire family had to come to our home in Canmore, and they stayed with us for 6 weeks because of the fires in their community.
Wow.
Yeah, and our son, one of our sons owns a farm, and all his trees are dying now from lack of moisture due to climate trauma. So I guess I'm saying that I have this professional interest and concern about these issues, but I also see now that they're really affecting me personally. So this has gone from the theoretical to the experiential for me.
Yes, the effect is really affecting individual lives now, very apparently.
Very apparently. Indeed.
Mm, thank you. And maybe we should still roll back to the museum activism questions. And would you like to share more of your rewarding milestones or experience in your career advocating for museum activism? Although you have shared a lot of phenomenal cases.
Yeah, those are the ones that come to mind. I guess the book that you're referring to that I did with Richard, there are 51 authors in there.
Wow.
From 18 different countries. And it's really a catalog of the answers to the question that you just asked. Classic examples about how activism has contributed to community well-being, has challenged, hatred, has challenged bullying, that sort of thing. I don't know if I should give any more examples. I just would recommend that people have a look at the book because there's all kinds of case studies in there.
Oh, great. I'll try. I will definitely see the book. Thank you. And maybe what is the main challenge you think the museum will face to engage in museum activism? I mean, we are not trying to find an excuse. We are just want to be ready for facing this challenge.
Yeah. I think, again, it has to begin with some serious self-reflection by asking a bunch of different questions. And I guess I've asked these questions, throughout my whole career, and they kind of underlie everything I've done, including activism. And the first question is, why and how have we as museum workers and academics allowed museums to become captured by the demands of the marketplace? Why is business replaced vision, mission, and values? I mean, I'm the first to admit that being business literate is a tool. I mean, every museum worker should know what their budget is, what their activities are going to be, what their goals are, what the outcomes are. But business literacy basically is a tool. I mean, it's a bundle of methods. It's not about values.
No.
I mean, values like social responsibility, vulnerability, imagination, service, compassion, humility, accountability. Those are values, and values underlie the notion of activism. Because without values, museums remain in their sort of insular state with an emphasis on money and growth and consumption, and that's no longer working anymore. And I'm really also curious, like, why museums are so preoccupied with method and process. I mean, how they do things. We keep getting better and better at what we're already doing well. Exhibitions, programs. We need to break those molds. We need to start doing things differently. Exhibitions are no longer the answer to what museums need to do. Community conversations and community mutual aid, I think, are much more important. And again, I've said this, I don't know how many times tonight or today for you, museums have to start asking, why are they doing what they're doing? Because as I said earlier, asking this question is going to usher in all kinds of meaningful conversations on what is relevant and what's important. And I'm just going to have a little drink of water here.
Thank you. Sure.
Another, I think, really important question is, in light of the times we live in light of the poly crisis, what is the public's role in reinventing our institutions? I mean, it's never asked and never answered. I don't think museums necessarily consult their communities when they decide to do something. But I think it's crucial now, as the world is beset by crises. And I see that, I don't know if you know the institution, but it's the Royal Ontario Museum. It's one of the biggest, oldest, most prestigious museums in Canada. Well, they just decided that they needed a new front door to welcome more people. So they're spending 130 million Canadian dollars on a piece of vanity architecture to sort of put frosting on the cake or dress up the front door. I mean, should that kind of money be spent now at this day and age? $130 million on a new front door? I mean, is this necessary? Is this accountability? I would say no. I'm quite critical of it. And a museum that's doing that sort of thing, to me, has lost touch with reality.
Wow. Yeah, that's a sad, unfortunate story, and that's nothing to do with the value you mentioned. Yeah.
No, it's all just it's vanity, it's conceit.
Yes.
And I think that, underlying our whole conversation tonight is, why do nearly all museums continue to separate the natural world from the cultural world? As I mentioned earlier, the notion of social ecology
Yes.
indicates that they're inextricably linked. But I've heard so many times in my career, well, we're an art gallery, we're a regional history museum. We can't deal with climate trauma. That belongs to the Science Museum or the Natural History Museum. Well, that sort of disciplinary hair splitting is not only dangerous, I mean, it's irresponsible. Museums have to begin to bridge this gap, because all of life is that interrelatedness. It's not separated by nature and culture. Both are dependent on each other. And museums have to begin to do that, because we need a new narrative. The narrative that dominates our society, and I think Taiwanese society, is that, well, economic growth is everything. And all we have to do is keep growing and spending and consuming more, and everything's going to be okay. But that's simply not the truth, right? I mean, the poly crisis has already demonstrated that that's no longer relevant. So we really need museums, which are ideally placed. Like I said, they're a storefront. They're 95,000. They can help their communities develop a new narrative, a new story of our life that goes beyond economic growth and consumption and all the sort of personal selfishness that we express, and replace it with one that celebrates and stewards our interconnectedness with the natural world and our reliance on the natural world and the need for mutual respect and stewardship. Museums, there's no other civil society organization that's better situated to produce that new narrative, or at least to develop a vision of the future, which is much more desirable than the one we have now.
Agree. Very inspiring. Yes. I would like to go back to ask you some questions about your experience of being the editor-in-chief of the Journal Museum Management and Curatorship. And could you tell some insights in your role as this editor-in-chief of this journal?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, I do have some thoughts on that. You just have to bear with me. Are you going to edit this tape?
Edit this page? Pardon me, sorry.
Well, when I say edit, I mean, are you going to go through it and get rid of the hums and haws and get rid of it if I've been talking too much? And
oh no, you are not talking too much. We are very appreciating that you are willing to share even your private or personal stories. No, you're yes.
Well, so back to the journal. It was an excellent journal, and very well known, but for a whole bunch of reasons, it had stopped publishing for about 2 years, and it was moribund, I guess you could say. And the owner of the journal approached me to see if I could revitalize it. So I think my mission was to maintain its already academic excellence, to ensure that the scholarship was readable and accessible and available to practitioners, not just academics. I wanted to expand its global reach and strengthen the idea of museums as socially responsible institutions. So I definitely had an agenda when I took the job, because I'd edited my own work and the work of others, but I'd never had a formal editor job. So it was a bit daunting, but I took it on because I wanted to promote the scholar practitioner model. And that's something I've always been committed to, even as an administrator, because I believe that scholarship has to inform museum practice. You have to study, think, read, reflect, and learn, and then use that in your practice. But you also have to have the practical realities of the practice to inform your scholarship. So they're two sides of the same coin, and that's called the scholar practitioner model. And that's how I see myself. And that's a model that I'm always trying to promote in the museum community, because there's a huge divide between museum academics and museum workers. And I did a sort of statistical study of the years that the journal was published and determined that I think it was over 65% of the articles were written by academics and not by practitioners. So big divide between the two. And that's not good because, as I just said earlier, method informs the scholarship and scholarship the method. So I did this by using my contacts in the museum world, as well as those of the journal's editorial board. I encourage museum studies students and authors from around the world who had English as a second language to get over their shyness and begin to participate. Now, it was tearing my hair out some of the time because that meant a lot of editing and rewriting, because when you don't have an language as a first language and you're trying to, work in a specialized subject, the writing can become quite challenging.
Yeah.
But we took up the challenge. We spent a lot of time at it. And ultimately, before I left, MMC became the leading global peer-reviewed museum journal. I think we had subscriptions in over 40 countries.
Wow.
I don't know if that's still the case. The journal curator, which you probably know about, might have replaced MMC with that rank. I don't know. But we also published special issues when I was there, which allowed us to approach a variety of practitioners and academics who could, write about and inform us about special topics. But even having done all that, there's still a huge solitude between museum scholars and museum workers. Because in my experience, I don't know about yours, but a lot of museum workers don't even read the literature. And I can see why too, because some of the museum studies writing is really difficult, complex, and poorly written. But we've got to do something to overcome the solitude between the scholar and the practitioner, because both are so important.
Yeah.
Although there are some exceptions, and Jia knows about this because she got her degree at the School of Museum Studies at Leicester. And I don't know if it was around when you were there, but they now have the Research Center for Museums and Galleries. And it's a classic model of where the practitioner comes together with the academic, and they each learn from each other, and then they adopt projects where they work mutually to find satisfying conclusions and solutions. And I wish that kind of collaboration was more widespread. I don't know what it's like in Taiwan with museum studies programs and practitioners. I don't know whether you're really collaborating or not, but I hope you are.
Collaborating. Yeah, some museum staffs will write articles, but in most of the cases, staffs are too busy. So the practitioner and the scholar are somehow separated.
Yeah, because the museum practitioner claims to be too busy.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
our project, our e-news project, actually are very friendly with the museum workers, practitioners, and they can write short articles to share their experience. So we realized that the academic journals are very difficult for the museum practitioners, and they do need to share their experiences. So that's why our project is quite different. We invite scholars as well as museum practitioners to share their experience, or we interview museum practitioners to share their insight and their work experience, such as we are doing the interview with you. And we did a lot of interview with museum workers each month.
Well,
So
that's really excellent. I'm really pleased to hear that. And I would hope too that you'll model that behavior so that perhaps museums as well as academic departments will give space and time and resources to those practitioners who do want to write. I mean, I look back on my career, and twice I've been given, several months off to work on a book because the museum administrators felt that was important. And museum workers need that kind of support in order to have the time and energy to write.
And they don't need to write like a lot of literature review. They
No.
just write directly about their experience.
Yeah.
And their insight. So because I'm from academic background, so I understand how difficult to write an academic piece of paper.
Yeah.
So there is really a big gap, but our project is very popular among museum practitioners. Mhm.
And so when you say the project, you mean is that the e newsletter?
Yes.
What
Yes.
is that what it is?
Yes. We
Well,
publish. Mhm.
Can you send me the link to that?
Sure.
Yes, we will do that, but they are all written in Chinese.
Well,
But
will Dr. Google translate them for me?
yes, but we will do some translation. We'll select some articles about Taiwan, about the museum in Taiwan, and translate in English. Each year, we will select several articles to do so, and we will send you links from previous years. There are 5 articles in English, and we will do that more.
That's really good. I'm really delighted to hear that. You're leading the way.
And that's very interesting. I'm not doing a lot in the academic journal, but in this more practitioners focused and oriented e-news. So that's some new direction that I'm doing now.
Excellent. You have my applause.
Thank you very much. And we did introduce about the coalition of climate justice. We wrote a small articles to introduce your coalition last year, and we wish to follow that short article to introduce your work and ideas more by interview this
Well,
time.
that's great.
Yes.
Really
Okay.
good.
继续吧，继续。
Okay. And okay, now maybe we should move on to the questions about your latest book. And could you introduce the key ideas of your latest book, The Museum and Societal Collapse?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I guess it's really my thinking about and you have a question about this, about the future direction of museums, because as I said earlier, it didn't get a lot of uptake with museums about the climate trauma, and then I just see everything getting sort of worse and worse and worse. So what's needed now? And I guess I wrote that book to once again try and get the attention of the museum community to think more deeply about what's really going on, and to start questioning the value of business as usual, and start questioning how they can become more, effective as social institutions, as civil society organizations. And I mentioned this notion earlier that I think museums are at a critical watershed. So the timing, I think, for me, for the book was really important, because the museum as mall is now obsolete, and now it's time to consider a new kind of museum. That's what I try to discuss in the book, this notion of the museum as a lifeboat, that it has a number of characteristics that we already discussed that enable the museum to assist their community in thinking through some of these problems and assisting them with actually coming up with tangible solutions, answers, and approaches to what can be done. So this new iteration, this new kind of museum, this more mindful and thoughtful museum, is really the subject of this new book. But at the same time, it's hard to be optimistic. I think the first half of the book, I don't know whether you've read it, but the first half of the book is pretty dark. It's pretty heavy, because it sort of sets the scene for the situation that we're in now. And it took me 16 months of research and writing to do that book. And I don't know how many references I looked at, but probably a good 800 to make sure I knew what I was talking about in the first half. But the second half is much more positive. It's much more optimistic, because there's all kinds of sort of practical ideas in there about what museums can actually do. But I guess to answer your question, I wanted to once again try to get the attention of the museum community, because the situation has become much more dire since our last book on activism.
Mm.
But again, it's a bit hard to be optimistic because I don't know whether you followed ICOM, the International,
Yes. Mm.
yeah, ICOM, and their new definition of the museum.
Yes.
They had that very lengthy process, involved all kinds of people. I mean, the process was really laudatory. But in the end, the traditionalists won the day. The new museum definition really doesn't differ much from the old definition. They put the word sustainability in there once. There's no context, there's no meaning, there's no value in the use of that word. So it's just a token mention. So I don't know. I mean, if ICOM is going to stick with that kind of definition, I don't know if there's a lot of hope for museums to actually change their ways, because it would appear that they have 40,000 members, and the membership doesn't want to look at the activist museum. It doesn't want to look at the socially responsible museum. So I felt it was my duty to ignore what ICOM did and try to challenge the status quo and get museums to think more deeply and broadly.
Agree.
And although my critique of society and museums is sweeping, I mean, it's really large, but so is my faith in museums, because I do think they can assist society in envisioning a better future. They're unique. They're valuable social institutions that really don't have any equal or any replacement.
Yeah. According to your point that societal collapse and even climate trauma is so important and so urgent case to deal with, but in your point, why still museum workers not dealing or facing it? Is it too uncomfortable to face, or is it a taboo to talk about?
Yeah, I think that, that personal discomfort's a major thing, but I also think that the very nature of museums, they need a lot of internal reform. I mean, I mentioned this notion of hierarchy, right? There's the lone CEO, there's the lone executive director. They have far too much power and responsibility, and they rob the individual museum worker from their personal agency. And when I say personal agency, I mean the willingness and ability to take action in the world to make it a better place. I mean, in my experience, museum workers are totally committed. They're passionate. They're well trained. They're intelligent. But so often they're in the hierarchy and they aren't allowed to express any of those values. They're very restricted and their work is prescriptive. They can only do certain things. That hierarchy has to be broken up, because nowadays leadership is really about the collective. The world's far too complex to let one CEO or one executive director or 5 senior staff decide the future of the institution. It requires leadership from everyone throughout the institution. So get rid of hierarchy. And when you get rid of hierarchy, then there's much more opportunity for self-organization, where the work can devolve to the most local level in the organization where it can be done well. So everybody gets together and decide this is what we have to do. Well, then you let the staff get on with it. They can decide how they're going to do it as long as everybody agrees on what the goal is. But again, that's not happening because there's too much hierarchy. There's not enough organization, self-organization and personal agency. I think another thing is this edifice complex. This complete hang up on the building. You hire these expensive architects and we build it and they will come. Well, that's no longer necessary. In fact, it's wasteful. I also think there's a difficulty with preventing museums from embarking on the future because of the governing authority. So many museum boards do not reflect the actual diversity of the communities where they live. And unless you have that civic reach, you just have a certain group of people with certain values and certain socioeconomic experiences who are in charge of the museum, ignoring all the other complexities of cultural diversity and other people's experiences. So that has to change too. I've written several papers on what I think will be required for museum reform, and it goes right down to the bones of the museum. But until that work starts internally, I don't think there's a lot of hope for museums to change. But while the institution is changing, I mean, I think that the individual museum worker has some responsibility too. And I think that they should start asking themselves some questions like, who am I? Why am I here?
Yeah.
What do I want to be in this time of polycrisis? What am I here to do?
Mm,
What can I learn from others?
mm.
What story shall I tell? What legacy shall I leave? I mean, those are very personal questions, but I think it's important for people to start asking themselves that, because I think it will serve as a foundation and a motivational platform to engage more in the work of the museum and to try and assume more responsibility.
Yes. And at last, maybe we should ask about ourselves, how do we fulfill those values?
Yes, yes. And first of all, decide what those values are that you want, right? How do you want to be treated, and how are you going to treat other people? And that's what values are all about.
Totally agree. Yeah. And I remember that you appreciating small museums because they are more grounded to the local, right? They are not bureaucratic. Yes.
Yeah, they're much more nimble. They're much more flexible. You know, they don't have those really deep and broad hierarchies. They're connected to the community. Everybody knows everybody else. So I think that the small and medium museum, they're really the keys to the future. I mean, they are the door and the key, because all these big museums that we're used to, you know, all the national museums, they're cumbersome. You know, they're process oriented. They're rigid. There's a chain of command, and they're just not able to react flexibly. But having said that, you know, there's some interesting stuff happening. I just heard that the head of the Tate in London recently had a museum COP28, where she brought together the heads of most national museums to get their commitment to start taking action in the climate crisis. So that's a breakthrough, because those big museums are usually unresponsive. So that's a good sign.
Yes. Good news to know.
Yeah.
I think you answered all the questions we want to ask. Really, thank you. So grateful of you answering all these questions and sharing your insights and even your childhood. Would you mind if I write the childhood stories you mentioned in the news?
You mean about growing up with a diverse family? You mean that? Yeah. No, that's okay, because that was kind of enjoyable thinking about that. You made me think about it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Okay. Actually, I got a question, but maybe I missed the timing. But still, I would like to know the answer. When the first time you live with the hunting camp, you mentioned that the actual situation, how they are different from what you learn, and are they welcoming you, and what is the tension between you and what's the relation?
My relationship with the hunters?
Yes. And first, are you are they very welcoming you? Yes.
Well, indeed they did. I mean, I think when we first went there, I think I was 23 years old, so I was quite young. And they live in a very severe environment. I mean, the winters are often minus 50 degrees Celsius.
Wow.
And they lived entirely by hunting. They did get some things through the trading store. They would get rice, coffee, sugar, some things like that. But basically, and they had rifles and they had snow machines, but basically they were living a pattern of life that was 10,000 years old. And they completely welcomed us, because had they not been so generous, we would have starved to death in a week.
Okay. Yes.
Because I wasn't a hunter at that time. They were, so they shared all their food. They shared everything. And we at the same time then became totally involved in their cultural life too. So my wife, Priscilla, worked with the women and I worked with the men, because, you know, there was a sexual division of labor. Women did certain things, men did certain things. So we both shared in their lives, and we helped wherever we could, assisted wherever we could, and they treated us with the utmost respect and generosity.
Wow.
And I think that's we're still in touch with them. In
Wow.
fact,
Yes.
3 years ago, we went back to the camp, and these kids who were 8 years old in those days, they're now middle-aged parents with kids.
Yes.
And so it was just wonderful. We had a great big celebration in the community hall, and we brought back with us about 150 colored slides that we digitized. So all these people who were like 55 or 60 could see themselves when they were 9 years old.
Wow.
And it was just a wonderful experience. So yes, it's been reciprocal and it's been generous and it carries on.
It's a life-changing experience.
It really was. And I think about it all the time. And I just feel so fortunate that we had that experience.
I thank you for answering and with such a wonderful story you told us. And maybe that's the end of all the questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your interest and support. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing what comes of this interview. And maybe we can get Dr. Google to translate it.
Yes. And can we take a group photo? And maybe we will email you again to ask for photos of the exhibition you mentioned, or the photos of when you were younger. Or yeah, that would be very interesting, especially when you were in the indigenous community. So yeah, so we want to do some reports different from others. So
do you want some pictures from the camp, for example, from the hunting camp?
Yes.
Yes.
And the exhibition
I have a good picture of myself skinning a black bear.
Wow. Wow. Great.
So we will ask you for more detailed information in the photos. And let's take a group photo.
Okay, let's take a screenshot. Okay. Please smile. And 3, 2, 1. And once again. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It was good to meet you all, and let's keep in touch.
Yes,
Sure.
we will. Good night.
Good night.
Good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye. 那个，仲文，我想你应该有做记录嘛，对不对？
有，
对，因为我刚刚在听到有一些展览呢，比如哪一个年份呢，或展览的照片，等你写写看，等你写完报道，我们再看要什么照片。譬如说，因为大部分网络都是他比较老的照片。所以我就很想要看到，比如他年轻的时候当那个人类学家的照片，应该会很有趣。因为我们做报道就要报道不一样嘛。那你刚刚挖了很多他年轻时候的一些故事，我觉得那应该蛮有趣的。对，但有一个小的问题就是，我没有继续问啦，就是因为我最近在看他早期的这本书，就是《Museum Trouble World》，因为中文有翻译，对，就觉得好像跟他这本新书都差不多，所以我不太知道新书到底有没有什么不一样的地方。这个或许你可以找一下书评，或者是我不知道学校有没有这本书，对，我们应该叫学校推荐，或者我们计划可以去买这本书。对，那个黄璐你来购买一下这本书好了。
好，老师是说最新的这一本，对不对？
最新的，因为旧的我们有。对，我不知道这本新书到底有什么不一样的，我读起来听起来都蛮像的，这是比较困惑的地方。然后他有举到一些例子，像文物归还，那个 medicine bottle 我也不知道 bundle 那是什么东西哦，所以可能你事后可以再写信问，或请他给个照片。对，这样我们就知道还有那个文物归还的年代，这种小细节，我想访问也不容易，因为他要回忆嘛，所以写信去问。然后他好像还讲到了一个女性癌症的一个展览嘛，对。那我想说哇，跟诗婷要做的研究很像，对，或许可以去挖一下， 这个展览的照片啦，或有没有相关的资讯。但你刚刚可以 Google 查一下，对，这也蛮有趣的。然后他说期刊已经停刊2年，我吓一跳了。
我也是。
它曾经是世界上最好的博物馆学期刊，但是他投稿非常困难。我为了投一篇到他们期刊搞了2年，他自己知道，我是这样认识他的。再被要求修改，非常非常累啊。对。然后后来他把期刊的总编交给，应该是交给 Jennifer Carter 跟谁？对，但不知道哇，居然停了，我吓一大跳。但他提到这个问题也蛮好的，就是学界跟实务界的那个巨大的那个鸿沟。
是，
对，这是个很大的问题。就我觉得我们的这个网络平台的确就是走另一条路啦。
对，
不要什么东西都要去写什么文献回顾啊，有时候只是想要分享一下我的一些实物或我一些展览的心得，对不对？对。那再来就是他好像改了一个新的 term， 对不对？他已经不谈 climate justice 了，他谈的是好像全球的危机，
对，
好像是这样子嘛。对，那这个没关系，你在趁你有空的时候，或记忆犹深的时候，可以来写一下。那再请黄璐把那个录影档再提供给我们。
没问题。
对，那还有那个 Glenbow Museum 啦，我上次去的时候，我去 Calgary， 事实上我是有空去的，刚好在修馆整修，所以我没有 Glenbow 的那个照片，所以这个部分，因为他也是工作最久，在这边当 director 嘛，所以你可以去要照片。那当然，他讲的很多东西都可以从中文这本书。那你们学校借得到吗？借不到，待会黄璐来找我，可以带走，放到学校，你可以参考。还有很多东西，这里面也都有提到啦。我觉得有一个概念是一直很一贯相承的。对，好，那你也可以整理一下访谈的重点。好，可能先打一个访谈的重点的那个摘要，
好，
去写文章会比较容易。
好，
对，访谈的重点打完以后寄给我，这对我研究也会有点帮助。虽然我比较聚焦在行动主义那一块。好，谢谢啦，各位辛苦了。那我看你也是很认真在准备哈。我今天早上才在听他那个 interview， 是那个好像是谁呀？Pierre 的访问，对，也是蛮清楚的，对，也是可以参考的。对，好，那大家辛苦了，那就加油了。
谢谢老师。
你们几月要去你们几号要去大溪
？3月21。
好。因为是自己的学姐，应该蛮好访问的啦。对，那加油啦。
好，
那1538时间抓得很刚好。好，谢谢，拜拜。
拜拜，
黄璐学姐，拜拜。